The eyes of the world and of 1.4 billion Catholics are fixed on Rome this week. Following the death of Pope Francis, cardinals from across the globe have gathered in the Vatican for the centuries-old conclave that will elect the next leader of the Catholic Church. The sacred process begins on May 7th behind the sealed doors of the Sistine Chapel. Until then, intense deliberations and spiritual reflection are underway among the cardinal electors, many of whom were appointed by Francis himself. Names are already emerging from the reformist voices in the global south to staunch conservatives from Europe and Africa, and speculation is rife over what direction the church may take next. Joining us is Father Lawrence Ndlovu, a respected Catholic priest and commentator, to help us understand the significance of this moment and the potential outcomes of the upcoming papal vote. Father Lawrence, great to speak to you. Now, the death of Pope Francis has left a major void in Catholic leadership. What is the mood in the church right now as the cardinals gather in Rome for the conclave?
Well, I think, of course, there's great expectation. The church is sort of pensive and praying and seeing what must happen next. The cardinals have been meeting and having their meetings, and it's not just the cardinal electors who have been meeting for the last couple of days, ever since Pope Francis, ever since the death of Pope Francis, but all cardinals are invited to the meetings before the conclave to deliberate on the future of the church, to take stock in terms of what has been going on, what are the needs, what are the most urgent needs, the direction of the church, and so on. That period is very important because, as you've rightly said, Pope Francis has appointed most of the cardinal electors from across the world. This means, unlike in the past where you had a lot of European cardinals and Italian cardinals and so on, the majority of the cardinals that are going to be cardinal electors in this conclave actually don't necessarily know each other. You know, the cardinal in Johannesburg might not know another one in Latin America. And this is probably going to be the first time in a long period, like about 2 weeks or so, where they are sitting and deliberating and getting a sense of each other. So there is a lot of expectation and waiting, but there is also the not knowing. I mean, I hear that a lot of people are talking about different papabile, different candidates, but we really can't tell because this particular conclave is almost unpredictable in a way.
Now, this conclave is historic in many ways, most notably because 80% of the voting cardinals were appointed by Pope Francis himself. So that's a significant number. But how might that influence the kind of pope the church is likely to get?
Pope Francis spoke a lot about the church moving to the peripheries of the world. And he did not just speak about it in his appointment of cardinals. He started making sure that the cardinals are spread, almost as representation from almost every corner, you know, of the world. And for this reason, the candidates themselves have a bigger pastoral sense. The majority of the cardinals that are there are actually running dioceses. They're actually working in real communities on the ground and so on. Not that those that are working in Rome, in the departments in Rome and leading very important, are not pastorally savvy. But it goes to show that his efforts of trying to make sure that the church resembles more and more the people it serves. This is the crunch time. This is the crunch test for that, because now any of those cardinals could literally move from a shanty town, you know, in wherever, to being the supreme pontiff.
Well, that's an interesting point, Father. Now, the idea of a pope from Africa or the global south more broadly has started to gain some traction. What would the election of someone like Cardinal Ambongo or Cardinal Turkson signal, both spiritually and geopolitically?
It would be interesting in that, of course, the church's footprint is growing fast and quickly in the global south, especially in the African continent. And so there would be some elements, although there's only 10, I think, if not plus, minus 10 active cardinals who are going to be voting from the African continent. But this process also began with the nomination of Pope Francis himself, who came from Latin America, what was considered back then sort of the new world. And so there is a push for, certainly we don't know quite clearly among the cardinals or not, but from talks around that it would be a good idea to have an African Pope, it would be a good idea to have an Asian Pope, and so on, to begin to show that the church is truly representational. We really don't know ultimately what it is in the quality of the man, because the bulk of the representation, the bulk of the decisions that influences the cardinals is more the quality of the man, and less about where they come from. If you remember the conclave that produced Pope Francis himself, it's because he had spent the bulk of his life being an ordinary bishop in the favelas and so on in South America. And the church fathers at that time in that conclave felt we needed a more pastoral approach. We needed a man with the people who fully understands the plight of the poor and the marginalized. And they went for a man who was closest to that amongst them. It could be anybody. If it is indeed the Ghanaian Cardinal Turkson, who has been a leading figure in the life of the church, heading a dicastery department, he's not a junior figure at all. In fact, he represented, at the death of Nelson Mandela, he was the official that was sent by the Vatican to represent the Vatican city-state here. So he's not a junior at all. And all of the cardinals are not junior. But what I'm trying to say is there's already thorough representation of the church in the life of the church broadly, in the leading of departments and so on, which the bulk of the life of the church does not just sit at the top, but in the everyday running. And there's quite a good representation there as well.
So you've talked a little bit about the possibility of an Asian Pope. Is the church, the Catholic Church, in your view, ready for a Pope of colour?
I think so. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be making colourful people, lack of a better word, cardinals. Because the intention is there. It's not a question of ability. All the cardinals, all the priests really of the world receive the same training. It is prescribed. So it is their experiences and their pastoral experiences mixed together with the abilities and particular gifts that they have. It could be a gift of great discernment, a gift of teaching. You saw in Benedict XVI, he was quite a teacher, quite a theologian, the solidifying of Catholic doctrine and understanding of it. It depends on what it is that the church fathers in their deliberations feel could be the most urgent and who is able to meet that need at any given time. So I think so. I do think that the Pope could come from anywhere. And you have seen, of course, there's, papabiles from the Philippines, from Africa, and so on. And that, if you've been reading some, it depends what people are trying to address. If they're interested, for example, in what secularly or in the media has been called conservatism or liberalism, you will find that they push, at least the press is pushing a particular name, and often black, white, or anything, but it's a question of where do they stand theologically, socially, and what posture they think the church should take. So to some degree, I have to tell you that all of us can't wait for this conclave to begin so that we can just get on with our day-to-day work.
All right, well, now some say that church is at a crossroads, right? Grappling with modern issues like same-sex unions, women in leadership, migration, and scandals of abuse. What kind of leader does a church need to face these complexities head-on?
I think one, if you're asking Father Lawrence Ndlovu, Father Lawrence Ndlovu will say one that is not evasive of these truths. We are faced with all of the above. A part of the work in terms of the sex abuse and all of that, Pope Francis had put protocols that are adopted by bishops' conferences across the world in terms of process and what must happen. So some of that has already begun. The role of women in the life of the church, Pope Francis had already begun that work in asking some, women to head dicasteries and departments and so on. But there are many other issues in the life of the church. And also what is important here is to understand that the role of the Pope, although is primarily to lead the bark of St. Peter, to lead the Catholic Church, it is also to take up this posture of being a moral voice in the world. And that is why issues like migration and refugees were such important issues for Pope Francis, and indeed important issues for the church. He set up a department for human development, putting together in that department issues of migration, issues of social justice and social action and so on, putting it into the core machine of the church. And the church cannot no longer act as if it is just an embassy amongst the people, immune from what the people are going through. The people we serve, as I did, and I said Mass this Sunday at the Cathedral of Christ the King, are ordinary people who are facing these very problems. Whether they are homosexual, whether they are migrants, whether they are whatever, they are still the people of God that must also receive the pastoral care that the church can offer. So I would say the leader that the church needs is one that can say, all right, we see all of this. What is the best way to respond? And what is the worst way to respond? What are we not doing? We're 2,000 years old. Plus, we've learned a lot in terms of what is the best way to respond, and what has worked, and what hasn't worked, and what we need to adjust in order to make sure that the church becomes the true home of all its children.
Now, final thoughts, Father Lawrence. The Catholic Church has 1.4 billion individuals, which is a significant number. And with it, obviously, the papal office holds much power and influence. Has the church done enough to speak on issues, some of the global issues that are happening across the world? Will there be need for the church to do more, for the new pope to do more?
The church has always taught through its social teachings that human dignity is at the core of all social and human interaction, that all people are endowed with dignity, inherent dignity by virtue of being created by God. So I do think if you read in the history of the church from, Pacem in Terris in terms of the Second World War and all the encyclicals and the teachings. But a lot of people forget, and it's a point that I'm at pains to explain to people, that the church is already involved in a lot of relief work, in healthcare, in education, actively. You look at any country, in the rural areas, the pioneers of healthcare and education and social justice and all of those has always been the church in the forefront. But still, with all of that, the church can never do enough. If it is truly going to interest itself as an institution of Jesus Christ, who was a social activist as well, fundamentally, the church has a duty to speak for the marginalized, to be where they are, to mobilize that all people must get the responses that are due to them, regardless of whether they are poor or rich. The church has always taught preferential option for the poor, and it is fundamentally called to those who find themselves on the margins of society. So yes, the church can never do enough, and it has a duty, as I said earlier on, whether they are in, in a rural place somewhere in KwaZulu, or whether they're in the city in Johannesburg. A church that does not have any social action is just devoid of its true mission as well.
Father Lawrence, great speaking to you on this Sunday afternoon. Father Lawrence Ndlovu, administrator at the Cathedral of Christ the King, speaking to us ahead of that much anticipated conclave where the new pope will be elected in the coming days.